The very first commandment says to worship no other gods, but several passages in the same Bible talk as if other gods are actually real. They sit in a heavenly courtroom, right around the one true God. That is not a contradiction invented by skeptics. It sits directly inside the original Hebrew text. Most modern readers simply never notice it. This video will answer 3 questions that rarely come up in a normal sermon. First, why does Genesis use words like us and our when only one God is supposedly speaking? Second, what exactly is the divine council, and why does Psalm 82 call certain beings gods? Third, why do some ancient manuscripts of Deuteronomy 32 use completely different wording than the Bible most people read today? By the end, a much bigger and stranger picture of the Old Testament's spiritual world starts to come into focus. Here is why this matters. This is not a fringe theory from some obscure corner of the internet. It comes directly from the Hebrew text itself. Serious biblical scholars have written about it for decades. Understanding it changes how several major stories in the Bible actually read. Start with the opening chapters of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 1, God says something strange. He says, "Let us make mankind in our image." A few chapters later, after Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, God says humanity has become like one of us. Later still, at the Tower of Babel, God says, "Let us go down and confuse their language." 4 separate times, the text uses plural language for God. Genesis never directly explains who this us refers to. 3 major explanations come from different traditions. Christian theology often reads this as an early hint of the Trinity, 3 persons within one God. Some Hebrew grammar experts describe it as a royal plural. That is similar to how a king might say we, to refer only to himself. A third view is common among scholars who study the ancient Near East. That view argues this language shows God speaking to an assembled council of heavenly beings. He addresses them directly before an important act of creation or judgment. All 3 views have serious defenders today. The text itself never settles the debate on its own. The clearest example of this divine council idea shows up in Psalm 82. This psalm opens with a striking image. God stands in the middle of what the text literally calls the divine assembly. There, he judges beings the psalm itself calls gods. God accuses these beings of failing to defend the weak and the poor. He accuses them of ruling unjustly over the nations under their care. He then sentences them to die like ordinary mortals, stripped of whatever status they once held. In Hebrew, the word used here is Elohim. It is a flexible term. Most of the time it refers to the one true God, but it can also describe other kinds of spiritual beings, not necessarily rivals equal to God in power. Most scholars agree this passage is not promoting the idea that other gods are equally powerful rivals to the God of Israel. Instead, it pictures a strict hierarchy. Lesser spiritual beings exist under God's total authority. In this scene, they are being judged and punished by him for corruption. The third piece of this puzzle involves a genuinely strange manuscript difference. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, most modern Bibles say that God divided up the nations of the earth according to the number of the sons of Israel. Older manuscripts tell a different story. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, this same verse reads, according to the number of the sons of God, instead. The ancient Greek translation, called the Septuagint, uses similar wording, referring to angels of God. That is a major difference in meaning. The older reading suggests something specific. It suggests God assigned each nation on earth to the oversight of a lesser divine being. Meanwhile, Israel stayed as his own direct portion. Many scholars believe a later Hebrew copyist changed the original wording. That copyist may have felt uncomfortable with the idea of other divine beings governing the nations. This single word swap dramatically changes how the entire passage should be understood. The fourth piece brings this whole council imagery to life in an actual narrative scene. In the first book of Kings, a prophet named Micaiah describes a vision of God's heavenly throne room. God asks the assembled spirits a direct question. He wants to know who will entice a wicked king named Ahab into a fatal military decision. One spirit steps forward and volunteers for the task. That spirit agrees to become a deceiving spirit, whispering false confidence into the mouths of Ahab's other prophets. God approves the plan. Ahab later dies exactly as predicted. This scene reads almost exactly like a royal court in session. God presides over spiritual beings who take on individual assignments. It closely resembles the opening chapters of the book of Job. There, a being called the Satan also appears inside God's heavenly court. That being receives permission before testing Job's faithfulness. Here is something that goes beyond just these 4 passages. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient religious texts from the region around Israel. These texts were written by Israel's Canaanite neighbors. They describe a high god named El, presiding over his own divine council. That council is surrounded by lesser divine sons. Many scholars believe Israelite writers were using shared cultural language from this wider region. At the same time, these same writers firmly insisted that their own God, Yahweh, stood far above any other so-called God. In other words, Israel was not necessarily inventing a brand new type of religious language from nothing. It was using familiar imagery from its own time and place. Then it reshaped that imagery to declare Yahweh's total supremacy over every other spiritual power that existed. It is worth being clear that not everyone agrees on how literally to take all of this. Some theologians treat this council language mainly as poetic imagery. In their view, it is simply a dramatic way of describing God's majesty, not a literal cast of divine characters. Other scholars treat it as a real description of an actual spiritual hierarchy. In their view, this hierarchy operates behind the scenes of human history in a genuine way. Both camps agree on one central point though. None of this ever suggests that any other being rivals God's ultimate power and authority. The disagreement is about how literally to picture the scene, not about who is actually in charge of it. There is one more detail worth adding before wrapping this up. The book of Daniel describes a similar idea much later in the Old Testament. An angel tells Daniel he was delayed for 21 days by a being called the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia until the archangel Michael came to help him. That verse implies a spiritual being was assigned specifically to Persia, resisting God's messenger on Israel's behalf. This lines up closely with the picture from Deuteronomy 32, where nations were placed under the watch of assigned spiritual beings. Centuries apart, 2 very different biblical books describe the same basic structure, a spiritual chain of command standing behind the visible nations of the ancient world. This naturally raises an obvious question. Does any of this mean ancient Israel was actually polytheistic, worshiping many equal gods instead of one supreme God? Most scholars say no, and the text itself pushes hard against that idea. The same book of Deuteronomy that contains the sons of God language also contains one of the most famous declarations in the entire Old Testament, known as the Shema. It states plainly that the Lord is one, and that Israel must love him with all of its heart, soul, and strength. Whatever these lesser divine beings were, the text never treats them as equals to Yahweh. They are always subordinate, always under judgment, always answerable to a higher throne. The council language describes a chain of command, not a group of equals sharing power. So here is the full picture. The Bible's opening chapters use plural language for God that has never been fully settled by scholars or theologians. Psalm 82 describes an actual courtroom scene where lesser gods are judged and sentenced by the one true God. Ancient manuscripts of Deuteronomy 32 suggest nations were once pictured as being placed under the oversight of divine beings, before later copies changed the wording. The vision in 1 Kings shows spiritual beings taking on assignments directly from God's own throne room, and Daniel describes a spiritual being resisting God's messenger on behalf of an entire empire. None of this describes competing gods on equal footing with the God of Israel. It describes a strict, one-sided hierarchy, hidden inside language most modern readers skim right past. That courtroom language never fully left the text. It just quietly stopped getting noticed. Translation after translation, century after century, If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to see more content like this and turn on the notification bell.